For the 2020 Trail Bike of the Year test, we tested 10 trail bikes, all with 120 to 140 millimeters of rear wheel travel. They were all priced between £3,000 and £3,500, plus a little bit for shipping. They were all tested here in the UK, and then we took the top 6 bikes out to Spain, where the BlackTown Trails crew gave us some excellent guiding to help us whittle down to the eventual winner. And I can reveal that that winner is the Propain Hugene. This is the 7th trail bike of the year that I've worked on, and as you'd expect, every year the bikes just get better and better. If you've not seen one of our Trail Bike of the Year videos before, first off I'm going to give you a quick overview of the bike, and then I'm going to talk about the frame, the kit, how it rides, and then our conclusions at the end. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon. That means you'll get a notification every time we upload a new video. Propain are a direct sale German mountain bike brand, and the Hugene is their latest 29er trail bike with 130mm of rear wheel travel. It's built around 140 or 150mm forks, and in this test we had a 150mm pair of forks plugged into the front. The Hugene is a full carbon fibre bike with the front and rear triangles held together with 2 counter-rotating links. The shock sits in front of the seat tube, which gives it a little bit of protection from rear wheel spray. It's a relatively unique looking frame. It doesn't have a regular 4-bar suspension, for example, and the whole sort of shock seat tube cluster looks a little busy, but we think it's one of the better looking bikes in this year's test. The frame is really nicely proportioned, and the top tube drops drastically towards the seat tube, giving plenty of standover. Handy if you're going to stop on steep technical terrain and put your feet down. As you'd expect from a fully modern trail bike, you get things like internal cable routing with nice guided stops, you get down tube protection to stop the carbon from getting damaged from any rock strikes, and there's chainstay protection too. There's always a lot of talk about bike geometry, especially in trail bike and enduro bike tests. Now, the Propain doesn't have the most up-to-date geometry, but it's far from being old school. So in a size large, you get a 457mm reach, and that's with a 150mm fork. If you drop the fork to 140, you get a slightly longer reach because of how geometry works. The chainstays sit at 445mm, which is reasonably long for a bike with a relatively short reach, but we'll talk about that later on in the review. You also get a 470mm seat tube, which isn't particularly long, but it's also not super short. The head angle is 67 degrees and the seat angle is 74.5, which again is pretty middle of the road. So the Hugene isn't particularly radical in its geometry, but what it means is that if it's new to you and you've come from an older style bike, it should be very comfortable to jump on straight away. You're not going to have to work your riding style around a completely new shape of bike, which makes it very easy to get on and ride. As I mentioned, Propain is a direct sales German brand, and if you know anything about the mountain bike market, you're going to guess that that means the value on this bike is exceptional, and it really is. Of all the bikes in this test, it had, I would say, arguably the best spec of any of them. It was the most expensive. It came in at $3,500 and a little bit extra, but for the money, the spec is impeccable. SRAM, who own RockShox, provide the bulk of the kit on this bike. So you get ultimate level suspension in the form of a Pike 150mm and a super deluxe shock. You also get an X01 drivetrain with carbon cranks, as well as SRAM's new G2 RSC brakes. The wheel set comes with a pair of Propain's own branded hubs, which have a fairly quick pickup, a set of Stans Flow Mark III rims, and a pair of Schwalbe tyres. Up front there's a Magic Mary in its soft compound, and at the back it's a Hans Dampf, again soft. Finishing kit comes largely from a brand called Sixpack, and it all seems pretty decent kit. The dropper post is a Bike Yoke Revive, which we've enjoyed using in the past. Now the interesting thing about Propain is that you can customise some elements of the spec to fit either your sort of desires and what you like, or your budget. So this isn't quite a stock build. It's a build that was slightly modified to fit what I like, and a little bit with what Propain wanted us to put on the bike within that budget. So that's all the facts and figures out the way, but how does a Propain actually ride out on the trail? When we were looking for our trail bike of the year, What I'm really looking for is a bike that I just want to go and ride. It's got to be fun, it's got to be poppy, engaging to ride. It's got to be able to climb pretty well as well. This isn't a bike that is necessarily going to be the fastest down a hill, it's got to be one of the best all-rounders. And the Propain, being the winner of Trail Bike of the Year, fortunately did possess all of those traits. It's not perfect, but it is really bloody good, and it was the bike in the garage that I consistently wanted to go and ride. Propain seemed to have engineered quite a bit of anti-squat into the rear suspension. What this means is that when you're pedalling, the chain tension keeps the suspension from bobbing too much, and this means you get a relatively efficient feeling suspension when you're riding up a hill. The shock isn't pumping up and down all the time. Now that's most relevant on this bike when we were sat down. And sat down pedaling up hills, very stable, very composed, and with the hands damped on the back, which is relatively fast rolling for a reasonably aggressive trail tyre, it didn't seem to hold us back too much on the trails. When we wanted to put a bit more effort into our climbs and maybe stand up and sprint, there was a little bit of bobbing through the back end, but that's largely unavoidable, I think, on most trail bikes. The Super Deluxe shock does have a compression lever on there, so you can flick it to tune out a bit of that, and it works pretty well in that regard. That said, the lever is quite a long way to go and reach to. While there are a number of bikes in Trail Bike of the Year that did climb pretty well, one of the things that stood out about the Propain was on steeper, more technical climbs, where there's a lot of routes or steps to go up and over. Here the bike just felt super composed. Sometimes I find that when you're riding up a step, for example, and you're trying to keep the pedals going, you get bucked or a little bit of lurching as the rear suspension extends under pedal tension. But the Propain, it just seemed to hunker down and grip and just get you over that rise without any sort of funny feelings through the back end. This meant that on tight, technical, steep climbs, the Propain gave you absolutely no excuses. It's not a barge of a bike, so it's nice and manoeuvrable, and given that there's a reasonably long back end, it puts you in a fairly centered position between the two axles. This again makes it a nice place to be on steeper, more technical climbs, and on those longer drags, nice and stable too. If we're being picky, a slightly steeper seat angle would put your hips in a better position over the pedals, but you can shove the saddle further forward in the seat post if you want to. Shifting through the X01 drivetrain is impeccable under power. It's a really nice feeling, positive action, and so if you are having to do those emergency shifts to get into a lower gear when something steep comes up, that drivetrain does work beautifully in those situations. Because the Hugene isn't some super long, slack sled, I found it really easy to pick up and place exactly where I wanted it. Whether that was going around tight corners between the trees or pumping off the backside of little slopes. It's just a really fun bike to go and ride, and that's kind of what I'm looking for from a trail bike. I've already mentioned that the anti-squat really helps on the climbs and when you're trying to put some power down, but there is a downside to that, and it's just on slightly flatter, more bobbly tracks where there's more high frequency chatter, there's a bit more feedback through the rear suspension than you might otherwise have had. Personally, I don't mind that. It gives a bike a bit more character and I quite like feeling what's happening below the tyres. Some people will prefer to feel a bit more insulated from the trail though. All this disappears when you get deeper into the travel though. It's very smooth, there's plenty of progression towards the end of the stroke. And although it's cliched to say, it is one of those bikes that makes it feel like it has more than the 130mm of travel it has on the spec sheet. This means that you can go real fast, especially down fast straights. The suspension soaks everything up in a very calm, composed manner. I'm a big fan of the RockShox suspension. It's very smooth, very composed, and very easy to set up too. We did have one slight query over the setup on the Hugene, and that's why it doesn't quite get absolute top marks. I'd say that between 40 and 60% of the way through the shock's travel, there maybe isn't quite enough support for some riders in some situations. What we found was that the shock would go through its travel at a faster rate than the fork would, leading to the bike kind of folding a little bit in the middle, which slackens out the front end. If this happens on or just before a corner, slackening that front end just led to a tiny bit of understeer. So the reason why we mention this is that because in setting up the bike, we think that you might need just a little bit more care and attention to the front and rear air pressures. Sometimes we ran the shock a little bit harder, and this made it pedal a little bit better, made it a bit peppier, a bit more pop, and just meant that the front and rear suspension was sort of compressing at the same rate. The other way, which my colleague Rob did when he was riding the bike, was to let a bit of air out the fork to let that sink through its travel a little bit faster. You could then add a volume spacer to add the extra end of stroke progression if you needed. It's just worth being aware when you're setting up the bike to get that balance just right. And when you do, we found it great out on the trail. So when the trails really open out into fast straights with big chunky rocks, the Propain works pretty well. Okay, a longer, slacker bike might handle those flat out sections a touch better, but as I mentioned, that rear suspension has that almost bottomless quality to it, and you can really power it through those chunky sections. One of the aspects I really liked about the bike was the wheel and tyre combo. The Stan's Flow Mark III rim is nice and wide, it's also not particularly harsh, which I particularly like, and the Magic Mary on the front in its Addicts soft compound offers bucket loads of grip in virtually every situation. It is a more aggressive all-rounder tyre, but it works well on rocks, it works well in the dust, which we had in Spain, and it also works well in the mud that we had in the UK. So you have acres of confidence in the front end of the bike. The back end just tracks really nicely, doesn't throw out any surprises, so while you can get to the end of the bike's travel, it's not a sort of shock when you do. It's nicely controlled and you're not bouncing off the bump stops of that rear shock. So the Propain Hugene is our trail bike of the year for 2020. It's a bike that, when it's in the garage, I just want it to go ride on a wide range of different trails. If you are looking for a slightly more aggressive bike, almost a mini enduro bike, maybe you want to look at something like the YT Jeffsy. However, if you're looking for a true all-rounder that'll do pretty much anything, I think you'll be very happy with the Propain Hugene. And don't forget, it's also great value for money. So there we have our winner. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications of every new video from BikeRadar.